Good morning everyone. I am happy to welcome you to today's session of the NPTEL course Indian Fiction in English. We are today discussing this novel by Allan Sealy titled Zelaldinus. This is one of his latest novels which was published last year in 2017, and it is a very different kind of a novel, as you would begin to see. It's a very slim, slender volume which you can finish almost in a single sitting, and the narrative is extremely interesting, a very racy narrative, but nevertheless it has an experimental, different kind of a form to it altogether, which makes this novel, which makes this attempt at a different kind of fiction extremely important to today's discussion. If you had noticed, this novel Zelaldinus, it has a very interesting subtitle, a Masque. And here we find that the entire form of this piece of writing itself is challenged because it's presented as a novel, and it bears a subtitle, a Masque, and the form is very different from the other conventional narratives that one would see if you care to take a look at this novel. And Sealy is not new to this sort of challenges and this kind of experimentation with form, and we realize this when we go through some of his other subtitles. Trotonama bears the subtitle a chronicle. He talks about a fable, a western journey, a calendar, an illusion, an alphabet, a diary. So these are the different subtitles which Sealy seems to have very carefully chosen for his wonderful set of novels. I leave this interesting exercise with you to identify the novels which bear these set of subtitles, the novels by Sealy which bear these subtitles. And you can also realize that in a very typical postmodern way, but not limiting himself to any kind of a theoretical framework, he challenges the conventions of storytelling, and he also inhabits a space which is Indian fiction in English, and manages to talk in a different rhetoric altogether, manages to share a different history, and manages to exhibit a very different kind of an identity altogether. This is what perhaps makes Sealy's works very different and very exciting, and Zelaldinus is no exception to this. And coming back to the subtitle, a Masque. What exactly is this? Is this work a masque or a novel? And it's also important to understand why he has chosen this particular form as the subtitle. You may have come across a number of works which bear the subtitle a novel, as if consciously asserting that this is the form through which I intend to convey this set of narratives, this set of information that I would like to get across to the reader. But here we find this novelist Allan Sealy very deliberately introducing a different kind of a form altogether. That too, this genre masque is not very common in the contemporary, as you know. In fact, if we take a look at the history of what a masque is, it's a form of an amateur dramatic entertainment. It was popular among the nobility in the 16th and 17th century England. This was played especially at a royal court, and since the artists, the performers were also amateurs, they also included members from the nobility. So in most cases, this masque was performed only within a closed circle. It used to happen in the royal court in the presence of the king or the queen, and it also consisted of dancing and acting, and the performers also had masked appearances. This form was originally developed in Italy, but it flourished during the 16th and 17th century in England. Ben Jonson, as we know, he used to stage them, and they were hugely successful and popular as well. And unlike any other dramatic performance, this has a peculiarity to it. Masque is mostly ceremonial. It is staged to bring history to life or to celebrate a marriage. So there is an occasion for staging it. And here in this novel also we find that there is a certain occasion that Allan Sealy enters into. There is a certain occasion that he thinks that it deserves a kind of a masque to celebrate it. And this occasion is a moment from the past, a series of events from the past, and there's a way in which he has managed to bring in this past and place it exactly in the contemporary. And also engage with the many socio-political differences and weave an exciting narrative out of it. So we find different kinds of things at work over here at the same time, and Masque also reminds us, the subtitle Masque also reminds us that this is meant to be as an amateur form of entertainment, that this is meant to be like a celebration, and more importantly that this is meant for a closed circle of audience who would perhaps really appreciate and really be entertained with the kind of performance that is about to follow. And Sealy, in his own words, he has remarked that this is a kind of a novel which is actually meant for performance. And whenever he has read out his novel, I myself had the opportunity to listen to one of his readings, and whenever he reads out his novel Zelaldinus, it is almost like a performance. And he truly believes that this is the kind of a novel which deserves that kind of a rendition than the kind of a reading which is done to novels per se. This peculiar genre deserves a little more attention. You might be familiar with this term verse novel. Zelaldinus could be very loosely considered as a verse novel. A verse novel is a novel length narrative which is told through the medium of poetry rather than prose. So we find a very fine blend of poetry and prose with a predominant way of poetic rendition. And verse novel is a very distinct, rather modern form as well. This should not be confused with the verse narratives of the older texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Iliad and the Odyssey. They did employ the vehicle of verse to share the narrative, but that does not make it a verse novel. In fact, the examples of verse novels from the contemporary, from the modern times would be Byron's Don Juan or Browning's The Ring and the Book, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, and a number of other books which also have been produced in an experimental form, especially in the postmodern writing period. And there is also a certain interesting work by Vikram Seth, his work titled The Golden Gate, a novel. This was published in 1986, and it was a surprise success as far as the Indian English fiction, as far as the scene of Indian English fiction is concerned. It also won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1988. The Golden Gate, subtitled a novel, it is entirely written in poetry. The form is poetry, but nevertheless the narrative makes it fall into the category of a novel. And this is what makes the current scene of fiction very interesting. In the contemporary, whether it is within the field of Indian fiction English or even outside its frontiers, we find that a lot of experimentation is happening as far as fiction is concerned, and it is a rather interesting and fact that Indian fiction is also participating in this move towards making the space of fiction more dynamic, more entertaining and more experimental to begin with. And about Irwin Allan Sealy, he is a very different kind of a novelist as far as his identity, the labels attached to his identity are concerned. He is an Anglo-Indian. He is one of the Stephanian writers. He also went to St. Stephen's around the same time when the other Indian fiction writers such as Shashi Tharoor, Mukul Keshavan, etc. were also at St. Stephen's. He was a Booker nominee, he was a Padma Shri awardee, and as an author we find that in almost all of his works, his mastery over poetic prose is very evident. And it's only in Zelaldinus, however, he makes his deliberate attempt to the entire narrative in the form of poetry itself. Even otherwise, we find that he always loves to experiment with different kinds of form, and that is something which makes his writings extremely distinct and very unique in comparison with the others. And coming to talk about his identity, though he is an Anglo-Indian Stephanian, a Booker nominee, a Padma Shri awardee, and many things rolled into one, we find that there is no conscious construction of any identity that one could begin to identify in any of his works. In his own words, each individual project seems to have its own logic. And I don't impose a pattern. It is entirely possible that this discontinuous mode of narrative is part of my culture and heritage. And in a couple of interviews, he has also spoken at length about his culture and his heritage, which has a discontinuous past, which has a kind of a lineage which is scattered all over. And this Anglo-Indian identity, which is inherent to his being in some form or the other, does not feed very directly into his writing. In fact, except for his seminal work, the Trottenama, a chronicle, he has not really engaged actively with the Anglo-Indian community or the identity. However, incidentally, his latest work, Zelaldinus, has an Anglo-Indian character named Percy, and he himself has again disclosed in a couple of interviews that the formation, the presentation of the character of Percy is also in a way through which he maintains to reflect a certain part of himself into his work of fiction. And if we try to introduce Zelaldinus, it is a book of verse born of an obsession for Fatehpur-Sikri. That is something which we would find from the beginning till the end of the novel, and even in his own discussions about this work, Sealy has always very consciously spoken about his obsession with this city, Fatehpur-Sikri. And the title Zelaldinus is from the Latin name given to the Mughal emperor Jalaluddin Akbar by the Jesuit priests who were at his court during his reign. And in the letters that they wrote back to Rome, they refer to Jalaluddin Akbar as Zelaldinus, and this is where this work gets its title from. And if I try to give you the plot of this work in a single line, this is the story of Percival. He's an Anglo-Indian man with a lover in Pakistan who goes to Sikri and meets a ghost of Akbar, and then they talk of India. And there are a lot of cross-border discussions, and many contemporary things also come into the fold of narrative. And this is, of course, kind of a union between the past, the Mughal past, and the present which we share with this nation. The Anglo-Indian identity of this character Percy or Percival is presented as a rather incidental fact. It does not have much of a bearing in the way the story is narrated or the different axes are located. The idea of history in Zelaldinus comes across as extremely interesting, and it is also a very unique fact that in most of the reviews, the idea of history is at the central point of discussion. I just show you excerpts from some of the recent reviews of Zelaldinus. One of them, it refers to the past and present, nobles and commoners, history and fiction rub shoulders. And this is not a new thing as far as our discussions on Indian English fiction is concerned. We have spoken at length about how history and fiction come together and how history slides into fiction in this body of writing from the very first set of writings onwards. Zelaldinus is also considered as a story which marries history with fiction and twists the arm of an emperor's goes in a cross-border love story. And this is certainly not an unadulterated presentation of history, a certain exotic past, but this novel shows us an Akbar and a Fatehpur-Sikri that we've never seen before. And this is not obviously the usual conventional national history that one is familiar with. This also, not only does this work of fiction traverse across the borders physically, it also traverses across the borders of time. So we find the Mughal history, the Mughal past seamlessly blending into the contemporary history, which apparently has its beginning only with the colonial moment. So there is a certain glossing over which takes place, which completely negates this idea that the history of this nation only begins with the colonial past, only with this break in the form of a colonial encounter. And this sort of an approach towards history is extremely important and imminent in this contemporary, where we find an increasing amount of fragmentation and disorientation in terms of understanding history. So here is Sealy, a very gifted artist, a very talented storyteller, who is inviting us to look at the Mughal past as a shared form of history which is continually woven into the contemporary which is continually woven and rather forcefully made to sit together with the many events of the contemporary present. This bit of a background is also important and useful in understanding the context in which the novel is written. The novel also tells us that until Attilio Petrucciolio in the 1980s paid attention to Fatehpur Sikri and did an extensive work on its architecture, nobody had cared to do a proper survey of this fantastic city. And this serves as one of the starting points for Sealy himself to begin engaging with this city as a builder. So at some level, Sealy also sees a bit of himself, or rather we can see a bit of Sealy in the character of Zelaldinus, because both of them were builders in one form or the other. Just like Akbar had built an empire together, here we find Sealy as a builder, trying to bring together different pieces of history from different fragments of time and putting them together as stories of individuals, as fragments of history, and also more interestingly as experiments with this form of writing. One of our students, Cornelius, will soon be talking to you in detail about some of the interesting themes and some of the ways in which the novel stands out within this field of Indian English fiction, and he will also be telling us about how this novel Zelaldinus can be situated in this larger body of Indian writing in English. And before we listen to that presentation, I want you to go through this introduction in the novel. I read to you this excerpt from Zelaldinus. And as the ectoplasm coalesces, as ectoplasm can, into neither palm nor camel, but pre-existent man, the air fair crackles in a bitter natural breeze. So squirrels freeze with upright hackles, and then he is standing there, mild in his seersucker whites, this king of kings, light of the world, trampler of tyrants, etc., etc., Zelaldinus himself. We find that there's a lot of intertextual references here. Light of the world is obviously from the Bible. We find him using images from different disciplines and different sites, and there is also a way in which, as this narrative progresses in a very elegant and a very profound fashion, he also uses etc., etc., to trivialize many of the things. So this is the beauty of this entire narrative. We find the coming together of many tones, many images and different kinds of languages, and the poetry, the beauty of the poetry in this, as you can see, it is really hard to miss, because all said and done, just like Sealy is a master of narrative, he's also a master of form. That is something which will be evident in the way he has constructed this novel, and as Cornelius would soon unravel to you some of the mysteries behind this novel and also share some of his insights from his own reading. I thank you for listening to this, and I also invite Cornelius over.
Good morning all. Today I will be presenting on Zelaldinus, a Masque, written by Allan Sealy. The objective of my presentation is to carry you all through the ideas, themes, plots, narrative style that are being used in the novel, and to find out where actually Zelaldinus lie in Indian fiction in English. Before going into the presentation, I like to quote few sentences that was said by John Mee and K. Sachit Anandan about Allan Sealy and his works. The first one is by John Mee. He quotes what Allan Sealy had said. Allan said that there are countless Indian forms that can be revived and intelligently reworked so that Indian modernism need not be a wholesale imitation of foreign objects. And the another one is Allan Sealy was an experimental Indian novelist who chose to write from the tradition and presented it in untraditional view. So these two phrases are very relevant in the works done by Allan Sealy, because you can see like all of his works differs from each other based on their styles. About the author, Irwin Allan Sealy, commonly known as Allan Sealy, was born in 1951 in Allahabad in Uttar Pradesh. He did his schooling from La Méritairie School in Lucknow, and he shifted to Delhi for his higher education at St. Stephen's College. He started his literary career in 1988 with the novel Trottarnama, a chronicle, which is believed to be written before Rushdie's Midnight Children but was published much later. Yeah, these are few of his other novels that he wrote. Hero, a Fable, From Yukon to Yucatan, A Western Journey. It's a travelogue. And The Everest Hotel, a calendar. The Brain Fever Bird, Red, an alphabet. The Small Wild Goose Pagoda, and Almec. Zelaldinus, a Masque, on which I will be presenting. So, reception of his work. Like most of his works are not published in India except Zelaldinus. His Trotternama was a very critically acclaimed book that got very much attention even in India, even if it was not published in India. So, all of his works are critically acclaimed just because of his unconventional style that he uses in writing and the unconventional plot that he uses. His unconventional way of writing bagged him many awards like Commonwealth Writers Prize in 1989, Sahitya Academy Award in 1991, Crossword Book Award in 1998 and Padma Shri in 2012. About the book, as I have said earlier, most of his books are not being published. It's the only book, Zelaldinus, which was published in India in 2017 by Elf Books in New Delhi. The most interesting thing about the book, the cover itself, other than the content it has inside, is the cover itself, in which Akbar is depicted with a pleasant and modernist twist. He wears sneakers and carries a modern stereo on his shoulder. It is reflective of the life which Akbar, now a far cry from his historic royal self, desires as a commoner, to be able to do common things, to be able to live a commoner life. So yeah, I found the cover photo itself very interesting, wearing green sneakers and all. Also the interesting fact is about the title of the book itself, Zelaldinus. Zelaldinus was taken from a historical letter that Jesuit father wrote to Rome, I guess, where he mentioned Jalaluddin Akbar as Zelaldinus. Yeah, about the novel. So, as Sachidanandan told that Sealy is an experimental Indian novelist, he becomes an experimental even in Zelaldinus by writing a prose in the form of poetry. These are few of the images that I took it from the book. So, you can find that almost 3/4 of the entire book is in the form of poetry. Only some parts are there in the form of prose, in prosaic form. The book is discursive and extravagant in nature. Like there is no linear flow from one chapter to other. Suddenly at first it will be talking about the priest, and then from the description of priest it will suddenly move to some other incident that is not related to each other. Yeah, the novel is a historical fictional novel with realism in it. The story starts in summer at Fatehpur Sikri with description of Akbar's palace and his chess game that he used to play using human pieces. It's a historical novel because the first starting itself says about the history of Akbar and his palace where he used to play chess with humans of his court, placing and playing. The narrator here comes for a trip at Fatehpur Sikri and resides at Hotel Trishul. So that's like suddenly from history comes the fictional part, the present, past to present. So yeah, during his visit in the palace the very next day, Irv meets the ghost of Akbar, Zelaldinus, at the fort. So like after meeting Akbar, he suddenly recognizes Akbar through the photos that he sees in the history books and all, and even Akbar recognizes Irv and they become friends. Like yeah, since Irv is not carrying any cameras or something, he becomes friend with Irv and Zelaldinus. He becomes a tour guide and shows the entire palace and describes each and everything that is present there. He narrates the story of Mughal Empire, the rich and varied culture life of Mughal dynasty. During that summer visit when Irv meets Zelaldinus, the entire summer is gone by the description of the palace life, the people that used to be in the palace, like the 9 jewels of like Akbar dynasty. The summer it ends with a quarrel between Irv and Zelaldinus regarding a topic of justice. Like he asks what justice, Zelaldinus asks what justice means to Irv. So the answer that Irv gives was not expected by Zelaldinus. So and also Zelaldinus asks what Irv does for his livelihood. So he says that he is a writer. Then he insults Irv for being a writer. So this is the first section of the novel. The second section of the novel, we can see a story within a story in the second section of the novel. In the second section, it starts in winter where Irv returns back, and this time also Zelaldinus, he warmly welcomes Irv and apologizes for his previous rude behavior on his work. Then to convince Irv, he says that okay, it's not a bad job, even my friends were novelists, they used to write all those things, and he requests Irv to create a story for him so that he can actually go out of the palace where he is totally frustrated and lead a common life out of his noble life that he was living in that area. So here in the second section, Irv introduces Percy, who is from Kolkata, who is actually in love with Nas from Pakistan, like the online love. Like there's a strange blend of history and fiction in introducing Percy itself. It's like in that story, within the story, the Percy comes as a tourist in that palace, and there's one person, that Father Monserrati, who names Jalaluddin Akbar as Zelaldinus. He meets that Percy and guides him to Akbar so that he gets some help, because he sees that Percy as a very tensed person. Then he meets Zelaldinus Akbar and tells all his problem, that he loves that girl and he is not able to meet her because he has been denied visa 20 times. And then hearing all the problem that Percy is going through, Zelaldinus offers a help, and they go on a journey to meet Nas in Pakistan. So the journey is a harsh one, as they are sneaking through the porous borders of India and Pakistan, as Percy has been denied visa 20 times. On their way to borders, like they have a conversation about the development that India had after Mughal dynasty, and again on the way to that border, they have a quarrel. It's like Zelaldinus and Percy have a quarrel, and like for a short while Zelaldinus leaves Percy, and Percy is all alone to go for Pakistan. But then on the way back, Zelaldinus comes back. They hire 4 camels, I think, yeah, it was 4 camels, so that it will be easy for them in Run of Kutch desert. So there is a long description of how they have been in Run of Kutch and all in the book. Then they sneaks to the, like in the border, Zelaldinus sneaks through the fence, and he ties the border pet guards who were there, and he lets Percy go through that porous border. Then by the meantime, when they almost cross the border, the other border security person who was on the watchtower wakes up, and he comes to know about the infiltration and starts firing, because of which one camel dies and the others runs towards the Indian border. So finally, after long struggle, they managed to cross the border, after which they board a train without any tickets and moved towards Karachi to meet Nas. This was the second part of the novel, second section. The third section of the novel is during the springtime, in which Irv comes back to the Fatehpur Sikri and have an internal monologue about the beauty and hype of the dead city. So it's like after describing the beauty of the palace and all, his sadness because of the death of his father, all those, and suddenly decides that he will be leaving the place by boarding a train, where he meets a girl who sits beside him and says and asks, "Is this love?" This is how it ends, the entire novel. Yeah, so this was the summary, and like along with the form of writing, the unique feature about the novel is that there are a lot of postmodernist elements present in the novel. This is yet another photo that I took from the book. So it's like, it's a very unconventional way of writing and using blank pages to describe, to convey something. So I'll read out these two and show how it is different from other form of writing that he usually used in other books and the other writers who wrote during that period. So first is, the topic is red stone. So gum pink, not red, really, tink 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 tink, it goes this way. Then quarried nearby, tink 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 tink. So you can actually get how he writes, and second one is about the Victory Gate. It's a statue. So there he writes an entire sentence in just one line without any space and all. So it is said, Jesus, son of Mary, the world is but a bridge, pass over it to the other side, and do not build your house upon it, spend rather your day in meditation upon eternity, peace be on his name. We can also see a lot of binaries in the novel, like history and fiction, the history of Mughal dynasty, and how Irwin Percy is yet another character who tries to blend with the history of Mughal dynasty. Even the characters are historical and both fictional. Say for example, the character, the Jesuit priest Monserrati, he is presented as a historical figure as well as a fictional figure during the time when he meets Percy. And also there is a blend of both history and fiction. The evacuation of Fatehpur Sikri, according to history, is that Akbar lost interest in the palace after the death of his 9 jewels. It is said in Amar Chitra Katha. In this novel, it is said in somewhat in a fictional way. Sealy says that it happened because one brown coin had lost its circulation. Because of that, the entire place was deserted. And the binaries of present and past is also can also be seen. It's like Akbar being the past, Irv being the present, all that. And the clash between traditional and modernity is also there. It's like during the debate between justice, Akbar tries to show the traditional view of justice, whereas Irv tries to show the modern view of justice, which clash among each other. We can also see few imageries in the work, like the porous border between India and Pakistan tries to show the porous border between poetry and prose itself. And the first, I think the second or third chapters where when Irv goes for a trip to that Fatehpur Sikri, he takes only a Bisleri bottle with him and does not take camera. I think Sealy tries to show something out of that, like in an article that was written by John Mee, it says images are framed and focused in ways which always leave something out of the equation by analyzing looking through the glass novel. By saying that he is not taking camera, he tries to show that he is trying to show the left out part of the Mughal history through this novel. The next part of my presentation is where to place Zelaldinus. Should we place it in the 1980s or 1990s, or keep it as a part of this and let the future decide where it falls? So I'll be giving out like part by part. So the novels of 1980s and 1990s explored the conflict between tradition and modernity in contemporary India without simply privileging one over the other. Like it was done in The Last Burden that was written by Upamanyu Chatterjee in 1993. So even in Zelaldinus, the conversation between Irwin and Zelaldinus and Percy on the topic like development of India that came after the collapse of Mughal Empire, and also on the topic of justice, it says that there is a conflict between tradition and modernity, but however Sealy does not say that okay the other one is more superior than the other. The second one is the novels of 1980s and 1990s try to connect nations and individuals even as they divide them. So this is yet another example from Shadow Lines written by Amitabh Ghosh in 1988. So we can see yet similar traits in Zelaldinus, like the love story between Percy and Nas tries to connect the nation and remove hatred through love. The next one is the novels are interested in recuperating history squeezed out of the state's homogenizing myth of the nation. In Shadow Lines and Midnight Children, we can see that in parallel with Zelaldinus, we can say that Zelaldinus shows the glorious history of the Mughals and signs of unsung bravery of Akbar, and also by reciting his crime through mockery. In an instance where Zelaldinus says about one incident where he is being haunted by a ghost of one person whose wife he stole. Mostly like in most of the incidents we won't know about that particular history about Akbar stealing the wife of that person, but through this novel Sealy also depicts the unknown history. And the next is, all of the novelists of 1980s and 1990s share an interest in retrieving suppressed histories. They all at the same time foreground in different ways the act of narration. Like I have said earlier, it sings the unsung history of Mughal dynasty using the voice of Zelaldinus. The novel wants to show the unknown Mughal history that are being suppressed and that are left out of the frame of that photo. Yeah, this is yet another phrase that was there in Midnight Children by Rushdie, chutnification of history. I like to say that Zelaldinus is a chutnification of Mughal history in order to save the tanginess of Mughal history. It's like Sealy is trying to depict the Akbar dynasty in a form that it does not change the total history, but slightly in a different way. I like to conclude by saying that presently I don't think we'll be able to place the novel out of 1980s and 1990s and make him yet another Rushdie of the early decade of 21st century, but I think all the characters that the novel has shares a common tradition of the novelist of 1980s and 1990s. Until a few decades is passed and another few more writers that plays with form of writing comes up in the near future, I think we can place Zelaldinus with the canon of 1980s and 1990s. Thank you.